Well, Spain had been, or was still, at this time, early 30s, still a predominantly feudal country. One of the strongholds of reaction in Europe, in Western Europe. And the people of Spain were beginning to move. King Alfonso had been ejected in 1931. A republican government had been set up, and although this was displaced in 1933 by another reactionary government, in the elections of February 1936, a new republican government had been elected. Now, it was clear that if this was left alone, Spain would become another breach in the world capitalist domination. And just as Britain had to help Japan in China because of the Chinese Revolution, which had begun virtually with the dismissal of the emperor in 1911, but continued under Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek in the early days. In the 1920s, after the First World War, so Britain felt that it had to help the reactionary elements in Spain to keep down the new breakthrough there.
And so, when the war broke out in Spain, and it wasn't a civil war, the form, in the beginning, was a civil war, but it was one of the stages on the way to the Second World War, in which Germany and Italy were involved up to their necks. When the war broke out, wide sections of the people recognized that this was fascism on its way and that it could lead to a Second World War. And therefore, in the first 2 or 3 days after the rebels under Franco had landed in Spain and were beginning to move north, ordinary people began to organize themselves in order to arouse people to demand from the government every possible help to the legally, democratically elected Spanish Republican government. And the thing that they wanted more than anything else was arms. And being legally and democratically elected, they had every right under international law to buy arms from any country in the world that would supply them. But the British government, above any other government, decided, because they were afraid of what a Republican government, a socialist government, would mean in Spain, decided that the best thing for them was not to give arms either to the Republican government or to Franco, called the Non-Intervention Agreement. Don't intervene. Keep your nose clean. The French government, under the Premier, the Prime Minister, Léon Blum, a socialist Prime Minister of a Popular Front government, was ready to give arms, but it was mainly the British government that put pressure on them not to do that, to close the frontiers between France and Spain. Hitler and Mussolini signed the non-aggression. And while in the act of signing it, they were already sending troops, planes, men, ammunition into Spain on the side of Franco.
Now the Spanish people, they'd elected a government carrying out well, even David Harold would regard them as quite in keeping with his programme. Liberal changes. It was too much for Franco. He wanted to turn the clock back. And it was too much for Franco's mates and supporters, Hitler and Mussolini. And they gave him help. Bombers, tanks, planes, regular units of their army. Hitler and Mussolini saw Spain as a training ground. They were preparing for war, and they tried out in Spain the techniques they used against us in Britain later. They smashed a town called Guernica, the bombing tactics that we felt in Coventry and here in Sheffield. They used new weapons. Some of the older ones here who in the last war will know about the 88mm gun, most effective bit of artillery in that the Nazis used. They tried it in Spain. The Blitzkrieg, Hitler tried it in Spain. So, what was the situation? On the one side, the Spanish people and us volunteers. Few arms, because the Tory government in our country refused to allow the Spanish government to buy their arms. The Tory government then put class, their class, above the best interest of their country.
First pictures from the Basque Republic of the holy city of Guernica, scene of the most terrible air raid our modern history yet can boast. Hundreds were killed here, men, women and children. 4,000 bombs were dropped out of a blue sky into a hell that raged unchecked for 5 murderous hours. This was a city, and these were homes like yours.
Insofar as the Spanish Civil War is concerned and its coverage in the British newsreels, you can use the newsreels on a variety of different levels. Of course, they provide us with invaluable evidence of the British perception of the war itself, but they've also got to be seen within the context of the news media campaign of the late 1930s, which was of course related to various other factors that were going on in Britain at the time, and most notably within the context of the Spanish Civil War, the policy of rearmament. And insofar as this was concerned, throughout the 1930s, anticipations about the next war were fueled by a fear of a new and devastating weapon, the bomber. It was felt, and it was repeated by politicians, that the bomber would always get through. The British people were therefore anticipating, if another war did break out, that the bomber would always get through, that it would devastate cities, it would destroy industry on the ground, it would absolutely decimate ordinary people who had not been involved in wars previously. The next war, in other words, would be a war in the front garden. This kind of anticipation about the next war, in many respects, is similar to today's anticipations about the nature of a nuclear war. In the 1930s, this fear of the bomber, which was fueled by politicians and, of course, by the media, also in turn fueled the general public pacifistic sentiment. This presented enormous problems for a government trying to sell a policy of rearmament against the dictators, which it tried to do during the 1935 general election, when the national government was indeed returned on a rearmament platform. Now, this kind of transformation of public attitudes from being overwhelmingly pacifist to supporting the government's policy of rearmament was one of the major objectives of the British government's propaganda campaign at home in the 1930s. And it was a campaign which reached new heights after the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. If, for example, you take the coverage by the British newsreels of the Spanish Civil War, and of Guernica in particular, you can see from the May 1937 Gaumont British newsreel that that Spain and the bombing of Guernica is used as a news hook to make the point to British cinema audiences that if they did not support the policy of rearmament, which was designed to deter Hitler, then British cities could suffer a similar fate. Hence, the commentaries point right at the end of the newsreel, this was a city and these were homes like yours.
See, we were sending a resolution to the government because of its non-intervention policy practically as soon as the invasion from Africa with the Moors started. But it was when Guernica happened, when the Germans bombed Guernica, and it gave the British people an impression, an indelible impression of what was coming if war did break out and involving us, what sort of punishment towns would receive after hearing and seeing some of the news clips, the news Pathy Gazette on the films and so on of the bombing of Guernica by German planes. So that this was a tremendous fillip, that once you got incidents like that happening, and it was rammed home into people's minds that they could be next, that you got a tremendous response, you know, if you got down and did the work, you know, and that's what, of course, what happened. But Guernica was simply a stimulus, as far as we were concerned, in order to get more assistance and more pressure put on the government. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that.
And the unhappy thing was that the National Council of Labour decided they would support non-intervention as well. And therefore, the Sheffield Trades Council and the Rotherham Trades Council were foiled time after time in the first 12 months, sending resolutions to the National Council of Labour, to the Labour Party headquarters, to the TUC, demanding that they put pressure on the government to send arms to Spain. And every time they were refused, because the Socialist International had decided that non-intervention was the thing. And the National Council of Labour, and in fact the Socialist International, bears a heavy responsibility for the fact that for the first 12 months until June of 1937, the labour movement here and in other countries was crippled by the fact that they refused to push their governments into supplying arms, which arguably could have turned the scales against Franco. Nevertheless, as far as ordinary people were concerned, the Spanish people needed help. And from the first week, when organizations were set up, in Sheffield it was begun by a small group of people from the newly launched Left Book Club that had been started nationally a couple of months before the war broke out. And they organized it, and for more than 2 years, 2.5 years, from July 1936 until the end of 1939, and even afterwards, collections were made. People every week, in the evenings, on Saturdays and Sundays, went round regularly, door to door, asking people to give food and money for Spain.
Yes, well, in May 1936, Victor Gollancz formed the Left Book Club, and it was so successful that branches were formed all over the country in order to form discussion groups to discuss the books which came out once every month. And a branch was formed in Sheffield in the summer of that year, The secretary was responsible for calling the meetings in the first place was Judy Collett, and quite a number of people joined, and we held meetings in various halls in the city. But in July 1936 was the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, and immediately the Aid for Spain committee was formed from members of the Left Book Club. It was a very broad organisation. There were members of the political parties, I mean, mostly of the left. There were people with religious convictions, there were people with no particular convictions, there were pacifists, a very broad shade of opinion.
Yes, I got involved in the Aid to Spain movement through the Left Book Club. That was a sort of literary club which publicised monthly books, and we had discussions on various aspects of political life in England. And it became involved in the general anti-fascist campaign with the development of Nazism in Germany. It became involved in the broad campaign, anti-Nazi campaign in this country. And when prior to the coming to power of Franco, during this struggle against the monarchy in Spain, we were involved politically to give as much support and help to the Spanish Republican forces. And we did it by attempting to get political support through the trade union and labour movement of this country. Most of us were members of trade unions, and as such we were able to pass resolutions through our trade union branches, and then these were forwarded onto the executive. And people in the Labour Party, who were members of the Left Book Club, also moved resolutions in their Labour Party organisations. And as a result, we were able to get quite a lot of political support for the Republican forces in Spain, because we realised at that time that it wasn't just a struggle of the Spanish people against the monarchy and the forces of reaction in Spain, but this was the beginning of the fight to crush democracy throughout Europe by the Mussolini and Hitler forces. And in addition to this, we also participated in the labour movement, demonstrations and so on, in support of Republican Spain. We also sent a delegation to the House of Parliament when the question of non-interventionists in Spain was being discussed, and we'd attempted through the labour movement to get the Labour Party to support the policy of non-intervention. Well, in addition to that, we had one particular flag day, and I can't remember the amount of money we collected, but we collected a tremendous amount. But the main activity was the collection of food for the Basque children, and we covered almost every area. Me living in this area of the West, it was mainly a sort of conservative area, but nonetheless we collected in this area, and the response we got was really tremendous, because I think the sort of sympathy for the Spanish people, particularly the Spanish children, had spread to a broad section of the community, and as such the response we got was really tremendous.
Well, why did we start? Why did we take part in the campaign to support the Spanish? The reason was, from my point of view at any rate, that we could foresee what was going to happen in Europe if Franco got away with this, the absolute murder of democracy in Spain, because that's what it amounted to. it meant that democracy in Europe ceased, because the Nazism in Germany was developing very rapidly at that time, and also the industrialization of Germany, which meant that from a imperialist war point of view, they were becoming dominant. And so that partly our support for Spain was self-interest, to prevent the same thing happening here. And also, it also got a big right-wing faction in this country that were capable of doing anything that Hitler or Franco had done in their respective countries. So we put everything into it. Well, what could we do? First of all was to get public opinion. And some of the events that were put on, not necessarily by us locally, but nationally, we got the organisation going by this time. And some of what I spoke about before, when Elizabeth Brown, was it? Isabel Brown. She brought some terrible things she brought from Spain that were used. You know, I mean, steel whips and guillotine things that were used by the Franco element. And these were the actual things. We put them on exhibition in Sheffield, and I should think more people went there than went to a football match. And it did make a tremendous impression, just that. Well, then we followed it up by these practical things I was mentioning. We've got to try and supply necessary food and that, whatever we could send. And that's the way we did it. We went round the shops and asked the shopkeepers to put a box out with a poster, homemade poster sort of thing, and the stuff that we collected.
Now, in the meantime, as I say, we got the promise of leaflets, collection envelopes, posters that were coming. And so the Aid for Spain really got going, I think, about January 1937. I seem to remember meeting in, it was an office over a shop in High Street, no, the corner of High Street and George Street. I think there was a photographer's studio beneath, and we used to meet in this committee room. The committee, we weren't elected onto the committee. You just came along if you felt that you really must be on it. So it was a loose body of people, and they varied from time to time. But I remember that some people that seemed to be there, that were running it. There was Mrs. Frances Wood, Mrs. Frida Tustin, Judy Collett, of course, her husband Harry. The secretary was Dora Pointer, who was a very efficient and conscientious secretary. And then I remember people coming along like Mrs. Hull and I think, Percy Cardwell, Betty Hunt, yes, Betty, and her husband. And I think there was it the Beryl Lawless? She's Beryl Barker now, but I think there was Beryl Lawless and Winnie Lawless, and Mrs. Lawless, and I could go on. You know, names keep cropping up, but it was, as I say, a very varied committee, and what we did in the first stages, we zoned Sheffield into various areas, so that if we'd got a certain number of people living in that area, they formed a team. And then, of course, we couldn't do anything until we got the material, but I think we started, perhaps in the early spring, perhaps about May time, I think we started taking areas of Sheffield, and I think the procedure was that we'd take the leaflets out one evening, and I think the collections were usually held on a Sunday, but we'd take the leaflets out perhaps Friday night or Saturday, and then we'd take the collection on the Sunday. But we also got the services of a sympathiser, a man who had a little van, and these meetings, these collections became quite well organised, really. Now I was asked to do one, and I did the Darnall area of the city, and we met at a sort of well-known meeting place, Main Road, Darnall, and we had this van with the very bright, with the posters all over it, and we divided into two groups. Each group took one side of the road, and in this particular road, Sunnyforth Road, that led from the main road, there were a number of side streets, and of course, you know, we were sort of darted down these streets, and I found these young teenagers absolutely priceless. They really were, you know, they really could dart about. It's a funny thing, but I don't remember particular incidents so well as other people seem to have done. But what I do remember were the children. As soon as they knew we were coming, because we'd leafleted the area about 2 nights before, and they were expecting, as soon as they saw this van with the poster on, they came rushing out. And then you see them belting down the, you know, down to the paths to their houses, and telling the parents, and out they would come with the tins and take them to the van and pile them in, and there was a real atmosphere of festivity about it somehow. Anyway, we soon managed to do that area, and then we would go, when the van was as full as it could be, we'd practically got to the end of the area we'd leafleted. It went down to the committee rooms, and the tins were taken out, sorted, and when they got a large number of tins, they were taken down to the Sheffield Canal, where there was a barge waiting, and finally, after a number of collections, when they got it loaded to capacity, this barge took it down to, I believe, down to the Trent and the Humber, and then of course it went on from there, you see.
And we began a round of collections of food and money for Spain, but we were in contact with the Boy Scouts, churches, Salvation Army. But our greatest problem, and I'm talking now in general terms of the party and the movement as a whole, was in relation to the Labour movement. Because, as you probably know, the policy of the Labour Party at that time was a policy of non-intervention. And other comrades who were more active on the Trades Council than me will be able to tell you that there's quite a long struggle on the Trades Council and in the Labour movement as a whole to get any sort of support. And it's ironical that you can go to the churches and the Boy Scouts and get more support for collecting for food for Spain than what you got from many sections of the Labour movement. But of course the main fight in the Trades Council and the Labour movement was to get support for arms for Spain. See, but in regard to the YCL, we'd put quite a number of young people out on the collections. We had evening collections, but the main drift, of course, was usually on a Sunday morning, because those days young people worked much longer hours. Many of them worked Saturdays, and the only really time they could get. Well, this meant a considerable change in for them, because the main recreation at that time, as far as they were concerned, was rambling, you see. And it was very much to the credit that they gave up the Sunday mornings to go out on these collections. We'd have 50, 60, sometimes more. It would depend a lot on a number of factors, weather and stuff like that. And we made considerable collections, but as to the amounts and the money and stuff like that, obviously I can't remember it. It doesn't matter. The point is that we did quite well in the sense that we got a lot of response from people, from ordinary working class people. We concentrated mainly on the working class places, although we weren't about going into other areas, but we often left out two of the churches and the other middle class elements in there.
Benny Klein was a joiner, and we scrounged wood, and he made a boat fitted on pram wheels. It must have been almost the length of this room. And a group of people would go around one evening, leafleted an area, saying that they were coming round collecting for milk or food for Spain. And they would collect the following day. And do you know, it was the most amazing thing that was known, that's ever been known of in Leeds. There was not one person that refused to give. Not one person. And they went round with this boat on wheels day after day for about 3 weeks. Now, we had to have a depot for all this. So there was a young woman who had a shop on North Street, but it's different North Street to what it is now. And she organised a shop for us. She knew the landlord, and it was an empty shop, so she says, she got the landlord to allow us to use this empty shop. And our wives, the women who weren't working during the daytime, would stand outside this shop and just distributing leaflets. And the most amazing things, you couldn't believe how the support that was wanted to give to Spain for food, for clothing, for milk, and this shop was piled high with stuff, both food and clothing.
Well, they give a wide range of foods, and after they got to know us, we've been back 2 or 3 times, they'd have the stuff waiting for us. But of course we often requested such things as tin milk and tin food, quite obviously. But people would have flour for us and things like that. Some even would bake bread for us, which was impractical, of course, but you couldn't refuse it. And of course we met a number of individuals who began to take a more closer interest because we drew them into the struggle, and some began to come out with us. Some joined the YCL and the party as a result of it. But the main items we collected, as indicated, were tin foods, clothing. We used to get clothing given to us, and of course money. As for personal individuals, I can't at the moment recall any, not offhand, because obviously it's such a long time ago. But there were a number of incidents and a number of individuals who stood out and, you know, made themselves known and felt. I mean, there were shopkeepers who you wouldn't expect well, you wouldn't really expect a lot, but they would become quite sympathetic, you see.
Well, the work I did was mainly, of course, getting petitions, getting people to meeting, but mainly I used to go around to the wholesalers. I used to take a van round. One wholesaler filled the whole van with cases of food, which was mostly beef, you know, the tin beef and all that sort of thing, nothing that, things that could be eaten, you know, was nourishing really, but he had in immense stocks, and this is what he did. because I think at that particular period the concern in this country about the situation in Spain was enormous. But the government, of course, wasn't concerned. It had some kind of, its policy was non-intervention, while
unfortunately
German fascism and Italian fascism were pouring in men, planes, etc., to assist their friend Franco. The British government did nothing.
That's right. He swept tins of food off a shelf into the sack, and you know, gave it to him. Quite generous of him. And there were a number of individual shopkeepers like that who would give us stuff. Yeah, there was one. Yeah, that's right. There was one. Birov gave us a case of beer, but we decided to drink it and we put the money in the kitty. No, we couldn't guarantee selling beer all the way there.
And me, in my little way, I used to work in a factory of 10,000 people, and we had a group of us who would go around collecting week by week the coppers, the sixpences, the shillings, so that we could build up some kind of fund so that we could send people to, we could send food, drugs and so on to Spain. We helped, the same group, we were involved in 3 or 4 different things at the same time. We were involved in the question of bringing children out of Czechoslovakia, out of Germany, out of the various countries that fascism had taken over, and we were collecting money, collecting food, and doing all this kind of thing all the time during the Spain days too.
On a Sunday morning, most Sunday mornings, we used to go around the streets here, all around, and the boys and girls, the woodcraft used to help too. They used to go around the doors, and people were very kind, because many a time there was neighbours passing by and they'd been shopping, and they used to bring tins of fruit in or food in here, so that when they came round on the Sunday, Al Boyer in his van used to pick them up. Eventually, that ran for quite a few weeks, and then the food was taken to Hull and taken by boat to Spain.
One of the first efforts that were being made was medical aid for Spain. They were so short of drugs and bandages and all that kind of thing that women, the wives of many of us, would be rolling bandages up to send to Spain, because they were short of everything and they couldn't get anything. The government wouldn't allow anything to go there. Even bandages and drugs, they would stop from going there. That was non-intervention. But we managed to get these things through somehow or other. Then there was a very, very big meetings where you've heard the other chaps talking about the Duchess of Atholl, Isabel Brown, Ellen Wilkinson, Strachey, and others who would come to, well, they were travelling up and down the country, raising aid for Spain in all kinds of ways.
But the committee decided to collect money and goods, as it was a large number of people helped in it, a lot that we never met, of course. Some people did the other side of the town, and we did this side of the town. My wife and I, and Mrs. Barker, and another chap, I don't know what, I forgot his name, but we were still, when we'd finished, at the end of the war, that we collected more goods and money than any little group of the older groups in Sheffield. There was a committee, the committee had a headquarters in High Street, and they decided that they centralised all the teachers' organisations, all the trade union organisations, and I believe the religious organisations, and it was surprising how much money that came in. We were surprised at the support we got from shopkeepers. We thought that shopkeepers had take the opposite point of view, but we did well, particularly on our estate. We got no end of tin food and money. And when the war finished, of course, the committee closed down. But before we did, they had a meeting at City Hall, and Alderman, late Alderman Ballard took the chair, and they all was full. I think there was more than there was a lot never got in. And Mr. Alexander, one of the commanders in the International Brigade, another chap, I don't know what to call him, they spoke, and it was a real good meeting. Well, after the war finished, of course, the committee broke up and we all went out individual ways. But one particular incident that stuck in our mind was a Christmas morning. It was the Christmas morning, I think, of the war finished. We heard some music being played, and it come nearer and nearer. It was Paul Robeson who was collecting for the Spanish fund, and it was Paul Robeson singing what did you call that song, that hymn at Christmas?
Oh dear. It was lovely. It was just as though he was on the road singing.
And the loudspeaker on the van. And there was collecting money that morning. That was Christmas morning.
It was lovely.
Holy night.
Holy night, I think it was.
Yes, Holy night. Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
It was marvellous. You'd have thought it was him himself singing. Lovely.
There was a village on the borders between England and Scotland who had a cloth mill, and they were making Scotch tweed. And we got a word that we could have 2 bales of cloth, provided we used it for doing things for Spain. We contacted 2 of our comrades, Joe Meister and Ronnie Mendelsohn. And we said, what can we do about this? We can get these 2 rolls of cloth. So they said, well, we know of a factory owner. We'll go and see him. So they went to see this factory owner in Skinner Lane, who said, after a bit of persuasion, said, you can use my factory for 3 Sundays, 3 successive Sundays, and you could sew and do whatever you like in it. But Joe was a tailor's cutter, and Ronnie Mendelsohn was a draftsman, a clothing draftsman who designed patterns and so on. They said, yes, well, we'll undertake to do this job. But the cloth, as I said before, came to our house, and those 2 fellows worked all night long, cutting out material to make youth's trousers. And there was a girl whose phone number I've given you, Gertie Roach, who was Gertie Taylor then, organised a group of girls to come on these 3 Sundays and sew up these trousers.
And I went to Blackpool with some of the boys for a holiday about June, and we were coming home when we discovered or heard that Franco had invaded Spain. So by the time when I got back home, the labour movement was practically on full alert because they'd been reading about what was happening and things were happening in Spain. So we weren't surprised at all that civil war had broken out. Our job, or we consider our main job, was to get as much practical material assistance for Spain, for the Republican government, as quickly as possible. But as you know, all over England, the campaign was being developed by diverse sections of the labour movement, all busily employed on different affairs. They were recruiting for the International Brigade, they were collecting, bandages, medical supplies, food, transport. Many others were doing all sorts of other things, writing articles and stirring the labour movement up in general, and trying to put pressure on the government to abandon its attitude of non-intervention, because they said they weren't going to intervene in this, going to leave it to both sides to battle it out. Well, we wanted them to take sides with the government against the fascists. So our job, what we did in the AU here in Sheffield, we decided first of all to get our Executive Council involved, because we'd had some clashes with our Executive Council who didn't want to move much on many of these things outside the general trade union activities, not unless they were pushed. And we got our Executive Council man to come down to a meeting that we called of the shop stewards in Sheffield and district about Spain. So it was a chap called Fitzpatrick at that time. He was a Sheffielder anyway. And he came up and he opened the meeting. And we committed the Executive Council to support everything we did, we proposed to do, to aid the Spanish people in this struggle. They did that, and then we got down to the job inside the factories. The first thing we thought about was if we can take proper collections week by week through the shop stewards movement in the big factories, we can get the money in every week on a Saturday morning when the two shifts have finished work and it's a holiday, they didn't work Saturday morning. And so we did that, and it was a tremendous success, because we had queues of people waiting outside that little room to come in and pay the money. It was 50 quid, 20 quid, £10, £5, according to the size of the places they were working in. And so all in all, we did a fair job. We also were collecting for a truck, a 2-ton, a Ford truck that had hauled a lot of stuff, and we achieved that as well. And with the Trades Council and all the other people involved, it wasn't long before several machines were bought and stuff was collected, and this was one of the contributions that we made as far as Sheffield was concerned.
Well, one morning as I was going to work, I used to go into the corner grocery shop and get a bagel, if you know what a bagel is. It's a round cake, and we used to get them buttered. It was in a shop called Granelli's. And these were queues of us working, because there were 10,000 people working in there, and a lot used to go into this shop and queue up and get a bagel. One morning I thought to myself, bagel? I'll get my bagel, and I'll take a tin of milk from the shelf there, a tin of Nestle's milk. And I took it into the factory, and I got a little piece of cardboard, maybe 12 inches square, and I put my tin of milk in the centre of the table. Now I'll try and explain to you what kind of a factory it was. 10,000 people working there, so you can imagine what size it is. It was 5 big rooms. Each room was big as a football field, the playing area of a football field, and it was all on one level. Room 1, 2, 3, and so on. I worked in the centre of the 5 rooms. From the beginning to the end, you could walk right through a central aisle that you walk right through the whole of the factory. And I worked about in the centre of the room. I brought this tin of milk in, and wrote on this piece of cardboard, milk for Spain, and I placed it in the centre of the table of where we worked. There was interest straight away. You know, people said, well, what's all this about? I worked on this table where there were 30 tailors working, and about 15 on each side of this table. At lunchtime, which was about 9:30, 2 or 3 of the, or 4 of the tailors slipped out of the factory, went into this corner grocery shop and brought back tins of milk. So instead of being one tin of milk, there was now 5 or 6, and they were being built up in a pyramid. Interest was being taken now because we could see people walking at both sides of the table, of this long table, and they were looking, what's going on, what's going on. Well, at midday, we had our lunch between 1 and 2. And at 2 o'clock, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of tins of milk brought into that factory, and my one tin had grown to 4 tins, had grown to 104 tins, and it was piled high in a pyramid. Well, this was the first day, Monday of the week. The second day, there were thousands of tins being brought in, literally thousands of tins of milk, and we couldn't put them on our table anymore. And the bosses were already, what's going on here, what's going on here, and they wanted to stop it, but they were too late, they'd slipped up. If they'd tried to stop it the day before, when there was only 4 or 5 tins on, they could have managed it, but when there were hundreds and thousands. So we persuaded the people to do their own pyramids, and you could see all over the factory, there was, in the centre of all these tables, pyramids being built up of milk. On the second day, I was saying, the man from the little shop at the corner there says, sent for somebody who was in charge of this. Well, I wasn't in charge of it, I'd only started it, so I wasn't in charge of it. He says, could you come in to see me? He says, if you buy the cases, if you buy the milk in cases, it would be much cheaper. He said, first of all, I'll give you a case of milk for your thing, but if you, instead of asking the or letting the people go out and buy a tin of milk each, or fetch 2 tins of milk each back with them, they put the money together and buy a case at wholesale prices. And that's what started on Wednesday. So at the door, there were cases of milk being piled up. But we did say one thing to these people who were collecting the money. I would have nothing at all to do with the collecting of the money. I told them that in advance. I said, you'll have to concentrate and get the money and trust somebody on your own table or bench or machine to go out and buy it, because I would not have anything at all to do with the money. Anyhow, it eventually became such a hurricane of milk that it was an impossible situation. And then it started, this was about the Thursday, and it was decided that on the Friday a van would come and take all the stuff away. Well, on the Thursday afternoon and on the Friday morning, there were people, workers of the factory, stood outside with boxes, and they were saying, instead of fetching milk, give us your money. And they got paid on, wages had been paid on Thursday, one department's on Thursday, another department's on Friday. And the boxes of the collecting boxes were not to the ordinary collecting boxes that you see now. They were using cardboard boxes, the milk boxes, and they were being, people with their last halfpennies or pennies were throwing it in there. Anyhow, on the Friday afternoon, midday, it was decided that the van should come and collect it. And we had probably 70 or 80 people, each with a barrow, and as they took it to one end of the factory where all the nearest entrance to the main road, and there was a big van, what do they call it, Pentaxnon, something like that the word is, stood outside, and we could stack the cases up, but we couldn't stack the tins of milk. And I had it written, the night before I had painted on a banner, milk for Spain from Leeds. A local lad was the driver of the van, a lad called Rhodes, and he said he joined the convoy that was going to Spain it was a convoy that went to Spain, and you saw him off, probably, and we said ta-ta to him, we said goodbye, and that was it. But when he came back again, he told us that the enthusiasm of the people, both in England and in France, when they went through France, there was nothing that would want to do more than that.
Yes, the dance. This took place in February 37, and to the best of my knowledge, was very well attended, because the Cutters Hall is quite a big place and was very popular for dancers at that time. My wife was a very good dancer, very fond of dancing, and she was a regular attender there, and we sold ourselves about a dozen tickets just among our personal friends. In the YCL, there was quite a big sale of them, of course, and I remember that the thing went on while quite late, 12 o'clock, probably even later. But it certainly was well attended, and it certainly was an enjoyable night in that sense. And to raise £100 in those days was quite a magnificent sum, wasn't it? No doubt about that. Don't remember the price for admission, but I think you could get about 500 people, if not more, in that place, couldn't you? And £100 was the equivalent of what? Well over 1,000, 2,000, I should say, today. Yeah, more than that, isn't it? Yes, quite a big sum. Yes, quite a big effort. All other memories have faded, except I remember the beer was great. And I, not being a great dancer, spent more time holding the barrel than I did dancing. And my missus kept looking at me and singling me, because she'd get caught, you see, in the dance with somebody she didn't particularly like, and she sending frantic signals for me to come and interrupt like, but I wouldn't do. I wasn't too fond of dancing, but she was. Anyhow, to the best of my knowledge, it was a spectacular success, both socially and financially.
There's never been anything like it before. There's never been anything so widespread since. The collections on behalf of the miners in the year strike 1984-85 was the nearest that it's come to it, but it was much bigger in the Spanish War period.
In addition to that, I worked on what was a refugee committee, which was, I think it was set up by the Trades and Labour Council, through which we attempted to get refugees out of Spain. And 3 of the refugees who came to Sheffield, they arrived in Sheffield just as they'd come from Spain with just the few belongings. I remember Fernando in particular just having his couple of blankets rolled up under his arms, and the others got small bundles, and they'd left the families and everything. And they'd been chased up to the border by the Franco forces, and they came to England, and particularly at that particular to Sheffield. And we were able to arrange accommodation for them, and they stayed until, well, Emilio died, I can't remember the date when he died, but anyway, he died in England. They he was a carpenter. I can't remember where he came from. And Dr. Villicid, he was a Liberal MP. He'd been elected to the Spanish Parliament. He was a Liberal MP. He was a dentist. And Fernando, he was a dentist. But none of them, they couldn't get jobs professionally in this country because of the sort of professional restrictions and the language problem. So what they actually did, they got jobs in transport, on milk rounds and all sorts of, you know. And in consequence, they were in contact with the Sheffield working class and became familiar with the way in which the Sheffield working class were organised, and as such sort of got not politically involved but socially involved with members of the trade union movement.
Early in 1937, the Spanish Republican government wanted to save the children in northern Spain, particularly the Basque children, and asked the other countries if they would take them. And several hundred came to England. The Sheffield Trades Council agreed to take up to 50 of these Basque children, but how many exactly we did get, I don't know.
I think there was 10 or 12. I can't remember how many came to Sheffield, such a long time ago. But they were living at Froggatt Edge in this like a long bungalow, beautiful place, and they enjoyed every minute of it. And when we had parties for them, and people who had an interest in them used to invite them to their homes. Mrs. Gavigan was a great cooperative woman, and she took an interest in that. And of course she had them at her house, and she took them to different places and arranged parties for them, all sorts of things. She really did a good bit of work while they were here. Then we had the co-op Brightside in Carbrook, who the manager was very interested, Mr. Holdsworth. And whenever we wanted to have a party to make some money, we arranged for about 500 people to join in the party at the cooperative in their cafe and restaurant. We had several parties there, which brought in quite a lot of money. Then we had there was visits to cinemas, different cinemas they were having, and of course Harold had to go out with the car at night and help to take them back home with the help of other people with cars. The children loved that. The little lights on the roadway, when they were lighting up with the car lights, they thought it was wonderful, and every time they saw these lights going around the corner, they cheered. They thought it was a wonderful thing.
And it was decided that we'd help in getting some of the children over. And I think there was about 20 came to Sheffield. A friend of mine, who was no politics at all, but he was a Catholic, and he thought that he ought to help. And he had two, a boy and a girl. And he used to play tennis at the place where I worked. And he used to bring him to watch the tennis matches, and I know them quite well. After the war finished, and I left the park, I don't know what happened to him. I expect he went back home.
We had another young man called Alf Boyer, and he had a van. I don't know what he used it for, everything, and you could imagine. And he used to take the children out, take them wherever they wanted to go, and arrange parties. And he was in touch with the baker at down at Dencliffe Woods, I forget his name now. And he used to give food and different things to people who were making parties and join in. And these parties were great affairs because mostly the food was given from other people, which was quite a big saving.
Then it was decided to bring a group of the Basque children over to England, and people were asked to subsidise a child that was brought over, and I remember we subsidised a child, what's his name, I've forgotten his name there, Yossi, something like that. And there was many of us. I remember a Mrs. Morrison who was also involved in it, and she was a market woman, person who worked in the Leeds market, which is a very big market, and she would get stuff from the markets to keep this place going. It was a place near Shipley, a big place.
My name is Barry Kay, and I'm President of the Rotherham Trades Council. And somewhere that tells you why I've been chosen to officiate at this evening's social in commemoration of the International Brigade and the tremendous commitment that we gave to the people of Spain and to the question of socialism throughout the world. One of the people from Rotherham that went and fought in Spain was Tommy James. Tommy James was later to become President of the Rotherham Trades Council, position that he held in high esteem. When I was asked to speak to this evening to do the introductions, I wondered how it would have felt to be somebody in the 30s and given that commitment to go to Spain and to fight against fascism for socialism. And I wonder how many people today would make that same commitment. And I search my mind and I look through people and I look at people and I think that I would be very, very hard pressed to find the type of person that would give that commitment in today's society in which we live.
From all over the world, 40,000 men and women volunteered to go to Spain to fight alongside the Spanish people. From our own country, Britain, about 2,300 went. And of those 2,300, now 526 still lie in the soil and the rocks of Spain. They gave their lives.
Yes, well, this is a photo of Arthur Newsom. It's being kept in the party office. At the moment I'm just repairing. It's kept in the party office in memory of him. He was 25 years of age and the secretary of the Sheffield Young Communist League. He was unemployed and he volunteered to fight in the International Brigade. He died in January of 1937, killed in Cordova. His body has never been found and there's no known grave of him, of course. But those of us who knew him still remember him. And he left a big gap in our ranks. When he died, we decided to hold a memorial meeting for him in the City Hall, which is one of the main buildings in Sheffield. And the YSL put on a display of its wide range of activities. Because we had a jazz band, we had a gymnastic team, we had a amateur dramatic society, and several other functions which we did. And they put on a display of the wide-ranging activities of the YSL, and we had speakers, national speakers for it. Again, I can't remember there were about 800 people there. I can't remember the amount of the collection, but it got good publicity in the local press on that. There are one or two funny anecdotes in relation to it, because we had to do it in with a bit of a rush, as it were. And one of the more energetic members of the YSL, known as Howard Hill, decided that we wanted a really good slogan for it. So we had a number of lads who were capable of writing posters and whatnot. And he got them to work on a slogan, a quotation from Byron, which is rather long, and it goes, "Yet, freedom yet, thy banner, torn but flying, streams like a thunderstorm against the wind. And of course the lads got, amongst them was my brother, they got working on it, you see. I remember he came in one night, 2 o'clock in the morning rather, quite exhausted, threw himself on the bed and said, well, next bloody time that Howard Hill picks a slogan for it, he says, we'll have a conference about it, and they cut it down by a third, because it took them a while, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, to finally get it done. But they certainly did do it. It was right across the front of the hall, and it was quite impressive. Looked quite impressive what it did do.
Well, as I say, we didn't know he'd gone to Spain, because he just left, and he wasn't there the next day or the same evening, and eventually we found out that he'd gone to Spain. But meanwhile, he had been saying that what needed to be done at that particular time. And
he was in the party.
And
he was, of course, was a member of the Communist Party. He'd been involved in a strike at Burton's at that time, which he did quite a good job. And he did say this was the way that Hitler had to be stopped. Here where Hitler had to be stopped. We later learned, many weeks later, they'd been captured and shot by the Franco's lot.
Now Tommy went to Spain and fought in the ranks of the International Brigade. And when we left Spain, the women of Barcelona presented us with that banner. And here is listed all the actions in which the British battalion fought.